My name is Helen Blyer, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Continuing Education at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And we're absolutely delighted to have you online with us today for this, our very first webinar to serve this particular community. I will introduce our fabulous speaker in just a moment. What I wanted to do is give you a brief word of context, why we are doing this and why we are choosing to resource people in this way. For several months now, we've had a team of deeply committed professionals working on Christian education issues in southwestern Pennsylvania. And we've been trying to envision together how best to support and resource the leaders and volunteers who do the important work of Christian education in our region, whether it's within a church or congregational context or otherwise. What we have learned are a couple of truisms that I'm sure resonate with your experience. Number one, times are changing. The structures and patterns of engagement in faith communities are shifting. We can no longer count on typical patterns of Sunday school or even people in our midst who have some basic familiarity with the Christian story. We found, number two, that as needs are increasing, the availability and time that people have to do this good work is shrinking. And we have huge numbers of really committed, good-hearted people out there who could benefit from some basic scaffolding in how to do this work they feel called to do. So this is the first in a series of webinars which we will be hosting bi-monthly as an experiment this year. We will be having face-to-face coffee and conversation sessions at the seminary in the intervening months. And we will also be hosting a major day-long workshop, formerly known as teacher training, now called Change of Course, which will be held in September. Please refer to our continuing education page for specific information. And it will involve a day of learning basic skills and resourcing and networking with other people who are doing this good work. We are also developing a web page to house links and resources for people who do Christian ed, and we will be posting links to all of our recorded webinars on that page. So if you missed part of today, or after being with us today, you realize, oh, I wish so-and-so had access to this webinar, you will have access to the webinar as the recorded module on this web page. Please be sure to send us your feedback, whether you're pleased with the format, whether there are topics you're interested in, whether there are things that we could do to improve it. You can send comments directly to me at my email address. It's hblyer, which is HBLIER, @pts.edu. And please share the info about these resources with your friends and colleagues who are also doing this good work. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our fabulous, energetic speaker today. I was so happy to be given Lisa Brown's name by a colleague of mine, our Director of Field Education, Reverend Kathy Brawl. I was asking for good, energetic folks who do Christian ed and creative stuff within the Episcopal Diocese here in this region. And Kathy, without even letting me finish my sentence, gave me Lisa's name. And she has certainly lived up to the hype in my experience of her and working alongside her. She has served as the Director of Children's Ministry and the Communications Coordinator at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Mount Lebanon, and will soon be joining Membership Vision, an organization that helps churches tell and communicate their stories and design formational opportunities within digital space. Lisa comes to us with a wealth of information, not only about working hands-on and face-to-face with youth and children, but also a deep familiarity and commitment to the uses of social and digital media in faith formation and community building. And you'll be benefiting from her expertise today. So without further ado, Lisa, we are so proud to have you as our launching webinar today, and very pleased to offer the opportunity to share your wealth of wisdom with our assembled community. So thanks for being with us today, and I hope this proves to be a great experience for everybody.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Helen. And hello, everybody out there. This is a new experience for me. Usually I'm in a classroom with people and there's a lot of interaction. So I want to encourage everybody, if you have questions as we're going through, or if you have comments and experience, I always find I learn as much from the people that I do workshops with. As much as the information I share, I learn back from them, and we'll all benefit. So if you'd like to chime in, please feel free to use the group chat. You can go ahead and type comments or questions. And I'll remind everybody that you are muted on entry, and that's why you can use the chat box. But if towards the end of the conversation, we can unmute everybody and we'll do a question and answer and have a little bit more of a free-for-all, which I like anyhow. So to start out, I want to say do not let the middle-aged mom exterior fool you. I am a little bit of an adventure junkie, and for the past dozen years or so, I have been traveling with Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, youth groups, confirmation classes. And just to put this into context, I want to give you a little bit of a rundown of some of the things I've done. I have traveled by foot, car, van, plane, train, duck boat, ferry, dog sled, funicular, which is a fancy word for incline, which we know in Pittsburgh, and gondola. And this would be the kind of gondola that goes up the mountains, not that goes through Venice, but Venice is on the list. In addition, I've ridden horses, snowmobiles, and bicycles. I have skied, I have whitewater rafted, I have roller skated, I have canoed, and I have kayaked. I have climbed the Alps and the Appalachians, rappelled down cliffs, rappelled off bridges, traversed high ropes courses, scuba dived, slept in fields, tents, yurts, Adirondacks, dorms, bunkhouses, youth hostels, one of which was named the Young and Happy. I was neither at the time. Trains, chalets, and a snow quinzhee on a frozen lake. And that's kind of like an igloo, but you have to dig it out. So I have done all sorts of kind of crazy things with youth and had a fabulous time doing it. Haven't lost anybody yet. So the big question is, of all that laundry list of adventure, what is the most dangerous thing that you can do with youth? The fact of the matter is just putting them in the car is the most dangerous thing you can do. When we were flying international, my Girl Scouts, they were a little stressed about the plane trip. And I said, you know what? You're more in danger driving to the airport. So statistically, driving is the most dangerous thing that you can do with your youth. So anytime you're going to get in the car, you really have to think about your safety protocols. And this is everything from a big trip that you plan for years and months in advance. And sometimes where it really catches you are on those little kind of last minute outings that you decide to do when you cut corners and really don't vet your drivers and think through your safety protocols in the way that you would if you were going on a much bigger planned trip. So the first thing you really can do is ask yourself, do I have to be responsible for the transportation? If there's any way that you can push that responsibility onto your families, onto your parents, that's usually the better choice statistically. If you're going bowling, have everybody meet there. Have the parents come pick them up. Realistically, that isn't always an option. Certain populations that we serve, transportation is a huge issue and we really need to provide it. So once you've determined that, yes, indeed, for whatever the reason, no matter how far you're going, you do need to provide transportation, really the first thing you want to do is you want to check with your insurance company because they're going to be able to tell, and when I say your insurance company, I do mean your churches. So you're going to want to speak to someone in your parish community, in your faith community that knows what the coverage is. And if they have any questions, you need to call your insurance rep. Some of the things that you might want to think about. First of all, who can drive? Who is covered? And that's going to take into account what licensing requirements they have. Are there training requirements that your insurance company expects for someone who's going to be covered? What certifications do they need? What age are they? It may be that your church policy doesn't cover 16-year-olds driving 16-year-olds. So you may have a youth group where it's very typical for kids to carpool, for a 16-year-old to pick up all their buddies and come to youth group. That's fine if they're organizing that. You may not be able to take on, and nor do you really want to, take on the responsibility and the liability of asking 16-year-olds to transport other 16-year-olds or other young people. And I don't know what the age cutoff is, but again, that's a question for your insurance company. In many instances, young people can't rent cars until they're 22, 25, 26 years old. So that's an insurance company question. The other thing you want to think about is what kind of vehicles are actually covered by your insurance company. If your church owns vehicles, if you have a bus or a van or whatever that your church uses, obviously that would be covered, but again, you want to check into who's allowed to drive them, and you want to find out what is the liability coverage for personal vehicles that people would drive. What is the liability coverage for rental vehicles? And anytime you rent the vehicle, there's always optional insurance. So you're going to want to talk to your church insurance company to figure out, do you need to look into any supplemental insurance? Vans are a particularly sticky point. 12-passenger vans are sometimes covered, but 15-passenger vans aren't. And so that's something you'll have to look into. And that can be a concern. I know in the past we've rented and specified 12-passenger vans for our mission trip, showed up to pick them up, and there's a 15-passenger van sitting there. So that's something you're going to have to be very cautious about and conscientious about and clear. If your insurance doesn't cover a 15-passenger van, working with the rental agency to say, we cannot have that. And, you know, you don't want it to be on the Sunday morning when you're getting ready to leave on your mission trip and you've got, 30 kids standing there waiting on a van. And you also want to find out what the coverage is as far as any sort of U-Hauls or trailers if you're bringing a lot of stuff with you. That's a whole nother level of coverage. The other thing, if you decide after all this, best left to the professionals, and you're going to hire somebody, either using a bus company or a minivan, you may need to provide proof of their liability insurance to your insurance company. They're going to want to see what the coverages are. And that's just it's something to make sure that everybody's covered. You may have to check with your drivers, if you are using personal drivers driving their private vehicles, what their coverage is. Obviously, you want the church coverage to handle it, but there may be some reciprocity or such that they need. All right, so the big decision is, what do you want to do? Do you want to go with cars and private vehicles, or do you want to go with a professional bus company with professional drivers? Some of the factors that will help you decide, what's the best way to go. Number one is going to be cost, and that's the reality of it. A bus with a driver is going to be a lot more expensive. We have found on some of our long-range mission trips, the cost of the bus can double or even triple the individual cost of going on the mission trip. So it is a significant conversation and consideration, and one that also ties into ideas of stewardship. We may say, well, is it worth it spending that on the bus? Should we be putting that money into the communities that we're serving? And that's a legitimate question. Where the answer becomes, well, maybe this is a good idea, we have found is when it's a particularly long trip and you would be worried about individual driver fatigue. Sometimes we have hired professional drivers if we're going to be in a city, because if you take 6 cars into the city, the likelihood of getting separated and finding parking space, it becomes a logistical issue. So sometimes having a bus is easier. You bring the bus in, you park it, then everybody takes public transportation. So sometimes that's easier. As I said, driver fatigue and also familiarity. When I took my Girl Scouts to Switzerland, we had basically been awake for 36 hours. And so the thought of driving for 2.5 hours through the Alps, where I'd never been in a van, was not a good idea. So we hired a driver, and that was great, and that really helped. Now, with drivers, depending on how long you're going, they're going to have mandated stops. There's hours that they can work. If it's an overnight thing, you're going to have to put them up in a hotel. You're going to have to pay for feeding them. So again, that all factors into the cost, but if it's a safety consideration, then it's worth it. Now, I will say, after we've been doing long-term mission trips for a while, the kids really got used to the party bus idea. And when we changed our destination to someplace that was much more accessible by private vehicles, we had some pushback of parents saying, well, but it's all about the bus ride. And then we had to have the conversation of saying, well, no, it's not. So those are honest conversations you have to have and really think about that, what's going to be best. Another factor can be weather. When we did a Boy Scout trip this was the sleeping on the frozen lake trip, and we had to drive through Minnesota, a 5-hour drive through Minnesota in January. We knew we would be flying for a while, going unfamiliar places. The roads could be bad. We thought, okay, again, we're going to hire someone that's familiar. Another consideration that you might want to lean towards private vehicles or vans or a few smaller vehicles as opposed to a bus is you have to think about what are we doing when we get there? Will our group remain together the whole time, or will we split up? When we go on mission trips in West Virginia, we have a number of different sites that we're working on that are all maybe 10 or 15 minutes apart. So if you were all on a bus, to try to drop everybody off becomes a real logistical challenge. So it makes a lot more sense for us to have a number of private vehicles that can each go to the sites as needed. If your private drivers or volunteers, we talked about, they cannot be teenagers. That's your first consideration. You do not want to take responsibility for teenagers driving. And secondly, you're going to want to make sure that they meet whatever the youth protection, safeguarding guards children, whatever the requirements are for your denomination to approve volunteers. And that may be an online training course, that may be a background and fingerprint check, but again, you're going to want to make sure that those people are fully approved as volunteers. And those people, as I mentioned earlier, may be required to take a training class if they're going to be driving a van. And whether that is dictated by your denomination, your state laws, just depends. When you're asking anyone to drive, and this comes into play more when it's those ad hoc kind of, oh, let's go bowling, and someone says, oh, I can drive. If someone is transporting youth for your church, for an official church activity, you need to make sure that they are a legal driver. And it sounds kind of ridiculous because you'd think, well, why would someone volunteer to drive who wasn't? But the fact of the matter is somebody could have a suspended license, DUI, unpaid insurance, and they might still be driving around. And you don't want to find that out after there's been an accident or an incident. So one of the things that you can do is you can ask people to provide a copy of their driver's license and proof of insurance. And that pretty much will weed out if somebody doesn't have it, they won't volunteer. I know a lot of scout troops and a lot of churches at the beginning of the year will ask parents who are likely to drive to youth group activities to do all that up front. So then they've got all that up front so that every time, you go to the bowling alley and realize you need someone to step in to, come get the kids, get them home, you've already taken care of that and it isn't awkward. So you just kind of do that up front. It goes without saying that you never want to allow youth to ride in the bed of a truck, the back of a van, a camper, any place where they're unsecured. And we've had to quash that. Again, where we go in West Virginia, one of the things that people like to do is go mudding and sit in the back of the van. And I mean, our kids, or not van, the truck bed, and our kids really wanted to do that and can't go there. So when you have your drivers, one of the things you want to make sure, never assume that people are going to do the right thing. And that really applies to all aspects of children and youth ministry. You are always better off to explicitly state your expectations and what the boundaries and what the guidelines are, because you would be amazed the number of people that will get a car full of children and drive 90 miles an hour. So one of the things that we always do is ask our drivers to take a driver's pledge. First thing, they must obey the speed limits and all the posted laws. Again, you would think this goes without saying, but it doesn't. Secondly, they need to make sure, obviously, that they are wearing their seatbelt all the time, and they need to verify that their passengers are at will. Again, you would be shocked the number of times that I get in my car and I say to my Girl Scouts, does everybody have their seatbelt on? And someone's like, no, she's sitting on it. No, this one doesn't work. It's under here. And there's this scramble. And I'm like, girls, you're 16 years old. How do you not know this? Or you may rent a van and discover that, in the third row seat, two of the seatbelts don't work. So it is the driver's responsibility every time they get in the car to say, does everybody have their seatbelts on? And sit until they do. Another thing, your driver needs to pledge that they personally will not use a GPS, a phone, earphones, any sort of mobile device while they are driving. In every car, you need to have a designated navigator. It can be another youth, it doesn't have to be an adult, but the driver needs to pledge that they will not do that. They won't text, they won't call. That is the responsibility of the navigator. The other thing is you want to stress with your drivers that they need to pack so as their visibility is not restricted. And Lord knows, when we go to the beach as a family, I don't know how we see. But again, there's a higher standard of care and caution, when you're taking other people's kids. So you want to be very conscientious about how you're packing your vehicles. Where that really also comes into play is if you have any sort of roof rack, making sure that that is properly secured. Again, that might be a question for your insurance company if there's any restrictions there. And you also want to make sure that you're following your safety precautions if you're hauling a trailer. And there are precautions and protocols as far as the lighting on the trailer, how it's loaded, how it's secured, how it's packed. Obviously, people should never be in it. And you really want to make sure that you're following all those. Check with your insurance company. The other thing that you need your drivers to pledge to, and we always have adults that struggle with this, because especially at the end and they're just eager to get home, you need to commit to traveling in caravan. Part of youth safety and protection is keeping the group together. Now, there's differences of opinion. Is it okay to have an adult in the car with youth and not have a second adult? Because in most youth protection protocols, it always calls for 2 unrelated adults to be with a group of youth. Realistically, we all know that when you're scrambling for rides, sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you don't have enough adults, and also that just adds that many more bodies, and then you need that many more cars, and that can be a challenge. So one of the ways to deal with that is to commit to driving in caravan. You stay together. You map out the route, and you say, okay, we're going to stop in the Bluefield McDonald's. And we'll get to this in a minute, in each car, somebody has a cell phone that has everybody else's cell phone numbers. So if someone needs to make an unscheduled stop, you call the other cars and say, all right, we're pulling over. And that's really, really important that you want to stick with that. The other thing, and it comes down to not being alone with any youth. A single adult may be in a car with a group of youth, but you need to think about when you're dropping kids off, instead of dropping them off at their individual homes, which could end up there being an adult and an unrelated youth in the car alone together, which you do not want. You are better off to designate a centralized meeting spot back at the church parking lot or wherever and have the parents come and get them. If you get into a situation where you absolutely have to drop kids off at their homes, if you can arrange it that, let's say, maybe a set of siblings, so you have 2 kids in the car and you drop them off simultaneously, or 2 friends that can be dropped off together. So again, you always at least have 2 kids and not a single kid and a single adult together alone in the car. And it's just really important to think through that in your strategies. In every car, you need a driver information packet. On that packet, you need to make sure that everybody has printed directions. Even though you are traveling in caravan, you are not following each other. That's a really dangerous practice. It definitely leads to taking more driving risks, such as running red lights. You don't want to go that route. Everybody needs the directions, the contact information of where you're going, the phone number, wherever. I will tell you that we've driven to a number of scout camps that are out in the middle of nowhere, and the GPS gives out. So again, that's a really important reason for everyone to not only have a GPS in the car that the navigator can use, but to have the printed directions, have a map, know where you're going, know the contact information. In addition, in the car, the driver needs to have permission forms, medical forms, a copy of all the information forms for everybody in the car. If the cars were to be separated and there would be any issue, you need to make sure that that driver has all the appropriate contact information for the kids who are in their car. Again, we talked about agreeing upon stops. So in your map, you're going to put the stops of where we're going to stop and eat and use the restroom and whatnot. Err on the side of overly frequent stops. I know a lot of us, if we're driving with our individual families, just want to push on through and get there. With a large group, it's always going to take 10 times as long to do everything you try to do anyhow, so you might as well just kind of accept that and build that right in. And chances are, if one kid has to go to the bathroom or needs a drink or needs to stretch their legs, most of them do. So you're not going to get there fast, but you're better to get there and have everybody in good shape and just plan those stops out. In each car, you need to have a cell phone that has the cell phones of all the other drivers plugged in. one thing I've seen before, oh, well, everybody has my cell phone number, but, so I'm up leading the caravan, and 3 cars back, somebody takes off on the wrong exit, and the person behind them sees it happen, but doesn't have their cell phone number. So they can't even call them and be like, hey, you just got off the wrong exit. So you need to make sure, power on the parking lot before you leave, get everybody together and exchange all the cell phone information and make sure that the navigator has that. Part of the challenge is making sure the navigator stays awake while you're driving and that the other navigators in the other cars are awake, because I've followed our youth director down many, many wrong roads because all of our kids were sleeping, and I knew he was going the wrong way and I'm beeping, but theoretically, you tell your navigator, you need to stay awake and, kind of be present. And so you want to make sure you have that. In every car, there should be a first aid kit. I'm a Girl Scout, I'm a Boy Scout. What can I tell you? You need a first aid kit. Just have the real basic stuff, ice pack, Band-Aids, whatever. I've used it many times, not necessarily while you're driving, but in instances where we got to the mission trip, the doors open, the kids run out, and somebody wipes out on the gravel. I'm like, you've been here for 2 seconds. So picking gravel, use an antiseptic, have your first aid kit. In addition, you want to think about other things that are good to have in the car. I would absolutely recommend a beach towel. If you've been in youth ministry long enough, you know that it's not a trip until somebody pukes, and it's always good if you have a beach towel to kind of contain that. It could also be used as a blanket in case of emergency. If it is winter, you really want to think about the different emergency stuff you want to have in the car, whether it's a blanket, shovel, water, etc., salt. And if you think you're going to be snowed in somewhere, which we have been, make sure you take your shovel out before the car gets snowed in, because if you can't get to the shovel, it's kind of hard to dig the car out. Learned that the hard way too. All right, driver decisions. Different people have different thoughts on what is okay in their car. And you also want to think about, my kids have always indicated that the getting there is part of the fun, and that's really part of the bonding experience and the community experience. So you can have this conversation with the drivers in advance and talk to them about such things as, number one, are kids allowed to eat and drink in the car? And some people are not comfortable with that. Some people are fine with it. I think if you're taking youth, you kind of have to be fine with it. But you certainly can constrain what you're allowed to have in the car. Are they allowed to have drinks? Are they allowed to have dry snacks? No messy snacks? And I'm very adamant about, if you were in the car and you left the trash, go clean it up. So you certainly want to not have the kids trash the cars, but they're going to want to eat in the car. But that's something you want to talk through with the drivers. And you also want to be really clear with your families and the kids of what snacks they're allowed to bring. Who's going to provide the snacks? Are you providing the snacks? Because the worst thing is when one car is like the party car and has all the food, and then your car doesn't, and that's just kind of a bummer. You also want to think about whether or not you're allowing headphones and electronic devices in the car. As I said, the car rides are often a big part of the bonding experience for the kids. So if everybody's got their headphones in, they don't really experience that. But then sometimes if it's a super long ride and you really want everyone to kind of sleep and rest, then the headphones might be okay. But that's a decision that needs to be made on a car-by-car basis. And if they're not going to have headphones in, you need to think a little bit about the music, and who gets to be the car DJ and what is okay to play. There's plenty of music out there that could be very uncomfortable to be listening to during a youth group event. On the other hand, depending on the relationships you have with the kids, it also can be an opportunity for conversation. Yeah, this is a catchy tune, but are you really listening to what they're saying? Is that okay? How do we feel about this? And you really can have some productive conversations that might be worthwhile. Most of the time, I find it very helpful to assign cars in advance. There's the logistical aspect of it. It means if I know who's going to be in what car, then I know what paperwork I need to copy to make sure each of my drivers has their appropriate packet of paperwork. The other thing is, it can take off some of the stress for the kids. I think as adults, we really underestimate the stress of like, who am I going to sit next to and who's going to be in my car? And, you know, it's like being the last person picked for the playground game. You know, everybody runs for a car, and you've got one kid standing there like, hey, you know, who do I go with? So if you sense that that may be the case, you definitely want to assign cars. Also, honestly, there are some adults that the kids are like, I don't want to ride with so-and-so. And like, you know, you don't want that. You've got your adults volunteering, and, you know, adults have feelings too. And it was funny, when I took my Girl Scouts to Switzerland, their biggest concern, I mean, we were going on high adventure, climbing Alps and rappelling and, you know, high adventure activities. Their biggest concern, other than what they were going to wear to walk around Paris, was who they were going to sit with on the plane. I'm like, girls, you've known each other for 100 years. Like, really? So take that stress out of there. The other thing I found really helpful, and again, you'd think you wouldn't have to tell people this, tell your kids in advance the number and size pieces of luggage that they can bring. I have had children show up for a 2-night confirmation retreat with a full body pillow and a back seat pillow. Like, where are we putting this? So it is really helpful to say to them, you need a piece of luggage, you know, and give them some dimensions that can fit in an overhead bin or whatever. And whether or not they can have a backpack or a tote bag or a pillow or whatever in the back of the car. One of the things, if you are going on an international trip or a really big trip, there is something to be said for ordering matching luggage. There's a slide coming up that you will see at some point in time. My Girl Scouts had what we called the big pink bags, and you literally could put a small child in them, and all of their stuff fit in it, and the rule was, if you couldn't fit it in that, then you were taking too much stuff, and that was really good. And then we had wee pink bags that were our overnight bags. And when you're standing in an airport after you've been on a plane for, you know, 8 hours, and seeing those pink bags coming down the baggage carousel makes it a lot easier to identify this as our luggage. So even if you don't have matching luggage, and I realize that's a little, you know, a little much, even putting something identifying on your luggage, if you're going to be flying or putting luggage on a train where it's going to leave your control, it's really helpful to have something matching. We had rainbow belts on our luggage for one of our trips, and that was really helpful. All right, group safety protocols. And this really is as much of a when you get there. How do you keep people safe when you get there? So number one, as much as I hate it, each leader has to have full paperwork for each kid. And I've had leaders push back. I don't want to carry all that. That's too much. That's going to be a pain in the neck. I mean, apparently it's not a pain in the neck when I do it, but whatever. And this also includes medical forms, contact information. Why is this? Well, obviously, if you have a large group, there's going to be times where you split up. And you need to make sure that if a kid is with an adult and there's any sort of emergency, that that adult has all the information that they need to deal with whatever might occur for that kid. So it's really important that they have that. You can shrink it down as small as you want as long as they can read it, but they really need to carry that. Additionally, each leader, and I would say each youth participant, needs to have a schedule for every day of the details and the places you're going to be going. This is particularly important, like in a city where you'll be walking around and, you know, if anyone were to be separated, they need to know where you're going next, because that's going to make, you know, reuniting and getting them back and finding them a lot easier if they know the next step, or they know where you've been, or they know how to contact the hotel or the youth hostel or wherever it is that you're staying, or if they know how to contact a guide or a group leader. The more information you can give everyone, the better. So it's really important, and it also builds a sense of ownership in the trip for your youth. They, you know, they're not blindly wandering like sheep. They need to be a part of this and responsible and take ownership of their own safety and presence. You want to make sure that each leader and each youth has some form of cash or credit and debit card. And paying for stuff is always a challenge. There's pretty much not a Girl Scout trip that I've ever been on that at some point in time I didn't reach in my pocket and pull out my personal credit card, you know, and buy ice cream for everybody or whatever. But so you don't want to put that burden on your leaders. But in the event of emergency, if they had to, they need to have some means of paying for whatever they need. So whether it would be to pay for a cab to get everybody from here to there, or if you get, a car breaks down by the road and they had to like get everybody lunch or whatever. You want to make sure that everybody has access to some form of money. You need to make sure that each leader has a cell phone. That's just a safety thing so that you can be in touch. If you're in a city, or someplace out in public, I would absolutely want to make sure that each youth has one too. I do not want a kid that we can't contact if we lose track of them. Now, in a camp environment, a conference environment, a more contained environment, then maybe not. And then, in fact, sometimes you don't want them to have the cell phones because they're distracted by them. But if it's a safety consideration, you want them to have the cell phone. And this is where my kids hate me. It's really helpful to go matchy-matchy when you're traveling with a group, especially when you're using public transportation, you're flying, getting on a train, getting on or a regional train or whatever. So that could be matching shirts, matching bandanas, sashes, matching nylon backpacks, something that identifies you as part of a group. And that's really helpful, again, when you're trying to get on an airplane or go through security lines or really go in anywhere as a group. It helps the people that are processing you through the lines to say, oh, okay, you 15 are all together, be together. If they can't identify that you're all together, it increases the likelihood that you might be separated, and that just adds a level of complexity to it. The other thing, I know when we go on our mission trips, the first day, all the kids wear their mission trip shirts so that when we're out in the community and we're buying resources that we need, picking up lunch, meeting the people at our work sites, meeting the people in the neighborhoods, that they see us as part of an entity, part of an organization, that it's real clear that we are part of a group and that this is what we're doing. So it's important from an identity standpoint and from a logistics and safety standpoint. The other thing is, any teacher will tell you, well, you have to count heads all the time. I push it on to the kids. I think, and the other thing is when you try to count heads, kids are like wrangling cats. If you can count and, this one moved, and it doesn't always work so well. We found it more effective to have kids count off. So before you even leave, you line them up and you give them a number, 1, 2, 3. But, you go down the line. And then when you say count off, they have to count off. And so that way, wherever they are in space, even if they're moving, they should be listening for their number. So that way, you not only know who, that you're missing someone, but, you're missing number 8. And someone's like, oh, that's Faith. She went to the restroom. She'll be right back. So I find that that's a more effective way than counting heads. Now, I will tell you, if you have multiple groups together and you've got 2 groups counting off at the same time, you might want to have one count and one go with alphabet or whatever. But it definitely tends, and again, that also pushes accountability and responsibility onto the group. They become responsible for each other. It's not just the adult saying, shoot, we're missing one. But again, it's the kids saying, oh, it's so-and-so, and that's where they are. And I think that's really an important component of travel. I also make a point, particularly when we are in a city or an open space or a place where there's a lot of interaction with the public. This could be going to a sporting event or an amusement park. Assign kids to specific adults. If you have 5 adult chaperones, instead of saying, well, we have 5 adults and 25 kids, each of those 5 adults should be responsible for 5 specific kids. So if I know I have, Stephanie, CJ, Faith, Emily, and Megan, then I'm always watching to see where they are. And it greatly decreases the likelihood that you'll lose somebody. You always have to stress the buddy system. Again, I'm a scout, I can't help it. But I think it's a really important and helpful practice to get kids into the habit of always having a buddy. Now, I will tell you, as in most instances, if you have an issue, it's usually the adults, it's not the kids. And you really have to have a conversation with the adults about the idea that they are there to facilitate the group. And what you want to avoid is that adult who says to their kid, oh, here, we're going to go over here. Well, that's a problem because now they've pulled their kid away from the kid's buddy, and it's put everybody in an awkward situation. So that is another conversation that you have to have up front with adults, that they are there to facilitate the group. And you want to make sure the kids stay with their buddies and they understand they are always with the buddy. And I always tell them, you're not marrying your buddy. You can change buddies throughout the week, but that's who you're assigned to today. And you have to think circumstantially. If you're skiing and your buddy goes down the slope and you wipe out, okay, if you're the buddy, you're waiting at the bottom until your buddy gets down there. The other thing is you want to set boundaries in the places that you visit. So if, for example, you're at a museum, you might say, all right, with your buddy, you can go anywhere on the first floor. At an amusement park, you can go here, you can't go here. Always set boundaries for kids. Depending on the age of your kids, if it's middle schoolers and we're in a museum, I have adults stationed in key places at the exits to make sure no one is blowing those boundaries. And that's really important. It's also important, especially, again, with middle schoolers or younger kids, the whole bathroom protocol thing. If everybody's going to go use the restroom, I like to have one adult that stays out just to kind of keep an eye on the doors of kids coming out of the men's and women's room. And, if you need somebody actually in there to be like, all right, are we done? Let's go, and kind of staying on top of that. Always designate a meeting place and a time so that everybody knows that if they get separated, this is the spot. And finally, you want to have an at-home emergency contact that in the event of emergency, if you're in a city and there's an issue, instead of having all the parents trying to call you, that you would call the person at home and say, okay, this is the status and this is what's going on. So it's really important to designate that they become the person who would field questions and concerns by parents at home. And that's going to make your job easier because you're on site dealing with the issue. And finally, if you are doing high adventure activities, when you're at your permission forms, you want to make sure you absolutely get those forms in advance because you don't want to have, the one kid that's standing there where everybody else gets to go ride the horse. And oftentimes those permission forms are in addition to whatever permission forms you might be utilizing. So talking a little bit about youth responsibility, and we've talked about some of this. It is their responsibility and they need to be on top of knowing where they're going, having the agenda. You want to talk to your parents and your youth about how much money they're allowed to have. I've had situations where people have sent 13-year-olds with $100. That's maybe not helpful. So if there is a limit, you want to set that with the adults. You want to be very clear with the adults on if they're sending their kid with $20, that you're not necessarily monitoring how the child is spending that $20 if it's a spending money. Or if the child is supposed to bring money and a certain amount is reserved for lunch. Again, you need to be very clear with your parents and not just assume people will do the right thing. If there are other requirements the kids are supposed to bring, you need to be explicit about that, whether it's lunch, a water bottle, sunblock, backpack, rain gear. As we said, they have to have information about the agenda, where they're staying. You cannot emphasize enough about being with their buddies. And really, again, encouraging them to be responsible for themselves and for one another. That, you're just there to make sure nobody gets hurt, but this needs to really be their experience. So thinking about some kind of specific situations having to do with public transportation. Public transportation can be a great way to get around. One of the things you want to think about if you're utilizing public transportation, particularly trains and buses, when you're getting on and off, you want to make sure that you have an adult on the front end and the back end, like the engine and the caboose. Because in rush hour in DC, for example, when you're there with 100,000 Girl Scouts singing Girl Scout songs on the mall, it can be a little crowded. And so you want to make sure, again, that the adults are there to kind of act as pushers and make sure everybody gets on and off. But even so, with your kids, you want to do some role playing and you want to say, okay, what would you do if we all got off the train and you didn't? You got stuck on the train. What would you do? And talk through with them how they would handle that. Would they, what's the protocol? Should they get off at the next station? Should they find the conductor? What should they do? You want to take the guesswork out of any eventuality that could happen. And so that's really important. And we've had a situation where we nearly got somebody stuck on a plane because she tripped with a deep dish pizza in Chicago. And, she saved the pizza and she got off the train. So it was good. But we thought through it. The other thing you want to think about with trains is purchasing fare cards in advance. Because if you've got 27 kids standing in line in rush hour somewhere trying to figure out the fare card machine, no one in that city is going to like you. So if you can do that in advance, That's a good thing. And the other thing we've discovered is that some fare card machines limit the number of fare cards you can purchase. So if you thought you were putting them all on your church credit card or whatever, not necessarily. Another thing to think about is the accommodations. Again, like the cars, you want to assign, there we go. You want to assign rooms in advance, and you see our lovely clean room in the middle there. You need to be very clear that there's no switch in rooms. Everyone's to be where they're supposed to be and stay assigned. If you are in a city, in a facility, whether it's a hotel or a youth hostel or whatever, where you are not self-contained and there are other people staying there, you really need to have an adult either per each room or each suite of rooms. That's really important. I'm also really particular about not allowing kids to kind of free roam in the hotels. If you as a family travel and you're okay with your 16-year-old going down to the lobby and getting ice or whatever, that's fine. But I think, again, we have to be a little bit more careful when it's other people's kids. And so be very conscientious about kids roaming in hotels unchaperoned. One of the things we lay out in advance, especially on mission trips where we're all kind of staying on top of each other and space is tight, or in camp situations, the respect for other people's stuff. Bottom line, if it's not yours, don't touch it. If you need something, ask. And again, that's really important. You'd think that would go without saying, but you can head off a lot of complications and aggravations by making these things explicit. The other thing we're big on is clean as you go. And you saw the picture of the room. We don't always succeed at that, but at least we try. And, really encouraging kids. Our kids are great for leaving soda cans everywhere. And really reminding them, clean as you go, clean as you go. Pick up that can, put it in recyclables. Let's stay on top of that. There's a lot of people, not leaving stuff in the bathrooms. Speaking of which, when you have a lot of people and limited facilities, the more schedules you can make, the better. When we go on the mission trip, the kids themselves took it upon themselves to post a shower schedule. And they figured out that, okay, the people that are coming back from working at the animal shelter smell, so they get first dibs on the shower. And, they kind of scheduled from there. And that's really important. And that allows them to solve the problem. And that way, you don't have kids standing in line waiting for a shower. Okay, I'm out now. I'm going to go get the next person and say, hey, it's open now. So the more you can schedule things and be systematic about it, the better experience you'll have. The other thing is don't clean up after kids. You're there to teach them to be independent. My big example is when the trash can liner falls down in the trash can and everyone just keeps tossing trash in, I say to them, I am not scrubbing that trash can. And after a kid has had to scrub a trash can, then they learn that if the trash can liner is falling down, pull it up, put it back on. So really being on top of the kids, whether it's unpacking the car, sorting the food in the kitchen, dealing with the trash can liners, cleaning up the bathrooms, sweeping the floors. I always tell them that when we sweep, the goal is not interpretive dance with a broom, it's actually to clean. So, you see who does chores at home and who has no clue. Thinking about meals. One thing I will say is a lot of times we try to save money on these outings and you end up eating fast food for 7 days and everybody just feels really gross when you do that. There are ways that you can save money and still eat reasonably. One of the things that we do a lot, if we're going to be eating out, rather than ordering off the menu, is that you can call ahead and just like if you were having a party and do things family style. Sometimes that's a good way to save money and also know what your costs are going to be. You really want to think twice about just kind of letting kids order off a menu because that can get out of hand. If you're going to do that, it's really important to send a dollar limit and say, all right, everybody's got $10. That being said, somebody's going to be like, well, they only spent $8, so can I get those nachos for the extra, $2? And it's always going to be a negotiation. Some places have online ordering, which is fantastic. You can get on and, everybody can customize their order to their little heart's content. We are big on bag lunches, refillable water bottles, the more you can bring with you. We're big on like Cliff Bars. When you're out traveling and you're not sure, when it's a transportation day and you're just not quite sure where you're going to get lunch, you don't want to deal with hangry kids and you don't want to be hangry. So having some sort of, energy bar is a fantastic idea. And finally, packing lists. Again, this falls under that category of the more you know, don't assume. To this day, my Girl Scouts are 18 years old, and they will still say to me, can we get a packing list? And so now I say to them, one of you generate a packing list. And I also say to the parents, and this started back in middle school, When I send a packing list, don't go pack your kid's bag. Hand the packing list to the kid and have them go pack it. Again, it's that ownership, that they take responsibility. And you know what? If you forget to bring socks and you have to borrow them from somebody, you're not going to forget socks next time. Or if you have to borrow shampoo or whatever. Make sure that there are details as far as spending money, permission forms, anything that would be out of the ordinary. Flashlights, whether or not they're allowed to have electronic devices, if you want them to bring a book or playing cards or something like that. And again, when you send that packing list, that's also an opportunity to share the itinerary and links of places where you're going and phone numbers with the parents. When you send that packing list also, it's really helpful to send the parents a list of all the adult chaperones and their contact information. Again, if there's an emergency and parents were trying to contact, it helps that they have everybody's contact information. That being said, you do want to designate a means of communication as far as your parents, what they're allowed to do. You know, you'll have kids that the parents are like, text me, you know, call me. I heard about a summer camp this summer that would post a video and photos every day of the kids, and parents literally had set up a secret sign that if they saw the kid in the background doing this, they knew that things were okay. So that's hard to deal with because part of travel is being independent and learning to function without parents. So sometimes you have to push back against that a little bit. And again, like everything, if you communicate in advance what the expectations are, that's going to help when someone kind of violates those or goes beyond the boundaries to say, but you remember, you signed off on this. One of the things that we did when we were traveling in Europe is we designated one adult who texted all the parents every couple of days. When we got to a new spot, she texted to say, hey, we're here. And so that kind of minimized. The adults heard from everybody, but didn't feel as much of an urge to keep checking in with their kids. So if you can schedule communication that you're going to blast out to the parents, that helps take that pressure off the kids. Some of the kids don't want their parents checking in on them constantly. And so if you can remove that, that can be helpful. So let's talk about group expectations for a little bit. One of the things you have to be realistic about when you are traveling with a large group is at some point in time, everybody is going to be on everybody else's last nerve. It's going to happen. And again, I prefer to talk about it in advance and say, okay, if you're irritated with everybody, if you are in a bad mood, you need to walk away from it. Let's try to de-escalate and keep little issues from becoming big issues. At some point in time, everybody's going to be cranky, tired, irritated, and we need to be gentle with ourselves and gracious with other people and be a little forgiving and kind of give people a little bit of room. As I said before, everything will take twice as long as you expect it to. So if you want to get out the door at 8 o'clock, just double the amount of time you think you're going to need. And that means half your group's going to be sitting around bored waiting for the other half. And after you've been together for a couple days or a couple trips, you begin to learn how each other travels and you begin to get a system down, and that's going to help. But initially, you have to leave extra time because you don't want to miss your planes, trains, and automobiles. You don't want to be late. And so to keep everybody happy, it's just going to take longer, and you just have to accept that. My theory with traveling is if one person has to pee, chances are everybody else does too, so it's always good to stop. We've talked about buddies, that you can be flexible, but they absolutely need to have a buddy. They don't need to marry them, but they need to have a buddy. We really want to think about not only respecting each other when we travel and respecting each other's stuff, but you really need to do work with kids on respecting the space, respecting the people that they meet, and especially when you're dealing with cultural or socioeconomic differences and concerns, that's really important to talk through that prior to going. We had a situation where we were in an area of Appalachia that there's a lot of significant economic concerns, and there are farm animals. And I heard about a group who came in, and the kids were trying to see what the pig would eat, and they were feeding the pig dollar bills. You got to be on top of that stuff, and really think about that in advance, and just model that behavior of seeing everyone as our neighbor and respecting the dignity of everyone that you meet. You can't give kids too much information. when we were planning our Switzerland trip, and we were also going to be in France and Italy, we met with a travel agent monthly, and bless her, she entertained the most minute questions that the girls had to really understand the culture that they were going into and what was expected of them and what would feel familiar and what would feel different. And it was great. There's no stupid questions. And I think that's really, really important that you facilitate those kind of discussions. It helps the group bond. It helps them to really fully enjoy the experience and get the most out of it. And you really need to make these trips, they need to belong to the kids. You as an adult could probably plan food for 30 people, go to the grocery store, be done with it. You need to push that on to the kids and teach them how to do that. It's not going to be efficient. The food's probably not going to be as good as what it would be if you chose, but they're going to own it. And that's where the value is. Not you facilitating a trip for them, but for them investing and planning and making these decisions. Kind of a subset area, special area I want to talk a little bit about too is high adventure. And I've mentioned that before, and we don't always think about that maybe in a church context, but I'm also coming from a scouting context. Here's what I will tell you. With our church group, every year we go whitewater rafting. With my Girl Scouts, like I said, we climb mountains, we zip lined. And you might say, well, why do that? Why is that really necessary? There is a sense of group bonding and accomplishment that occurs when a group of kids can say, like, yeah, we did this. Half our group fell out of the raft, but we got back in and we owned that. My Girl Scouts were going into their junior year in a very academically challenging school environment. They were nervous about it. And the number of girls that said, you know what, I can do this because I climbed a mountain in Switzerland. And I was like, yes, this is why you do it. So it's that sense of group bonding. It's that sense of accomplishment. So I'm a huge proponent of high adventure. But there's some considerations. Number one are the safety protocols. You have to make sure that you're going with an operator that knows what they're doing and follows the safety protocols and really has a sense of the best way to do all these things safely. A great resource, if you want to do high adventure activities, is to contact your local Boy Scout council, because I found, if you're rappelling and the safety protocols say to wrap it around the tree 3 times, they wrap it around 6. So they definitely take safety protocols very seriously. And the other thing is, you don't always need to do the most adventurous things. Sometimes a little bit of adventure is really all you need. When we thought about whitewater rafting, and we said, you know what, we don't need to do the highest level of rapids that we possibly can, because kids who have never done it are going to be like, oh, yeah, okay, I guess. When the kids who have done it already are really pushing for, a little bit more, a little bit more. So a little bit of adventure can go a long way as far as your group bonding and still keep it relatively safe. And the other thing you have to think about is, how do you handle somebody who's uncomfortable and says, I don't want to do this? As a leader, how much do you push and encourage? And when do you back off and say, okay, this is not for you, and that's okay? And so that's something you'll have to think about. The other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is international travel. And certainly this can come into play with youth groups going on mission trips internationally. I would say that international travel, it is absolutely indispensable to either deal with a travel agent or a group who has already done this. You don't want to be on the ground having problems and trying to solve these on your own. I mean, unless you are a really experienced international traveler, I think this is one instance where you definitely want to go through the professionals. Secondly, you're going to have to make decisions about paperwork, copies of passports, and how you're going to handle that. Everybody should always have a copy of their passport, whether it's their actual passport. I read a tip about taking a picture of it and having it on your phone, something to think about. This is absolutely an instance where I would buy the extra travel insurance, because this is going to help if, again, there's any problems, to cover just the additional cost of addressing whatever the circumstance is. Important to note, we discovered at the last minute that permission forms to travel and to medically treat internationally often have to be notarized. They don't necessarily in the United States. So something to be aware of. And you also, again, want to be very clear up front about your expectations with any sort of currency. You as the leader don't have to do the currency exchange for everybody, nor do you want to be standing in line at the airport. So again, upfront expectations about what kids are supposed to bring, the denomination, how much, or what currency it's in, that's really important. AAA is great for that, we discovered. And the other thing that you need to really push on the families is they need to look into the whole cell phone plan, because you could have a kid that is getting automatic texts, and that's really running up their bill. So we're really coming to the end of our conversation here. We didn't get a chance for any questions. But again, I would just stress that I think there's nothing better for growth emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually than traveling. It gets kids out of their comfort zone. It introduces them to a whole new world, new people. And if we really want to think about who is my neighbor, this enables us to actually go out and meet our neighbors. And that's really what we're all about. So that's all I've got for today. I hope this was enjoyable, and, peace, love, and have an adventure, everybody.